Montana, 1874. The gunshot echoed through the frozen night, sharp and sudden, against the silence of falling snow. Miles Abernathy's eyes snapped open in the darkness of his cabin, his body tense with the alertness of a man who had spent 17 years in the wilderness. For a moment, he lay still, listening. There it was again, another shot, distant but clear. Miles pushed aside his wool blankets and rose from his bed, wincing as his feet touched the cold wooden floor. At 57, the mountain winters seeped into his bones more deeply each year. He lit a lantern, the yellow glow revealing a face weathered by time and solitude. His once handsome features were now lined and rough, his brown hair streaked with gray and worn long tied back with a leather cord. He moved to the window, wiping away frost with his palm. Outside, the snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing the clearing around his cabin in pristine white. The pines stood like sentinels, dark against the snow. Miles strained his eyes, searching for movement in the forest's edge. There shouldn't be anyone this far up the mountain. Not in this weather. Not in February. Miles dressed quickly, pulling on wool layers and his heavy buckskin coat. He grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace, checked that it was loaded, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He stood on his porch, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. That's when he saw it, a trail of dark spots marring the perfect white carpet of snow. Blood, fresh enough to still be visible in the falling snow. Miles hesitated only a moment before following the trail. In 17 years of self-imposed exile, he had learned to mind his own business, to let the world beyond his cabin clear itself without his interference. But something about those gunshots, about that blood on snow, pulled at him with an urgency he couldn't ignore. The trail led down the mountain toward Pinewood, the small trading post that served as the only outpost of civilization within 2 days' ride. Miles visited only when necessary to trade furs for supplies, to hear news of the world he'd left behind. Its owner, June Sawyer, was perhaps the only person he might call friend, though even that relationship was more like mutual respect than true friendship. As he neared Pinewood, the blood trail grew heavier. Just beyond the tree line, Miles found him a man sprawled face down in the snow, a dark pool spreading beneath him. Miles knelt, turning the body over carefully. The man was a stranger, perhaps 45, with spectacles still perched crookedly on his nose. He wore a city coat, not the rough garments of a frontiersman. A doctor or professor by the look of him. Miles searched the pockets, finding a leather wallet with identification papers, Dr. Edmund Clark from Chicago. There was also a folded letter, blood-stained but still legible. Miles squinted at it in the dim light filtering from the trading post's windows. "Must return with the girl immediately," it read. "Red-haired child is key to everything. SR will not wait longer." Miles pocketed the letter and continued toward the trading post. As he approached, he could see lights burning inside despite the late hour. He climbed the steps, stomping snow from his boots, and pushed open the door. June Sawyer stood behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face lined with the wisdom of her 65 years. She looked up as Miles entered, and something like relief crossed her features. "Thought that might be you," she said. "Heard you were the only soul crazy enough to be out on a night like this." "Found a dead man in the snow," Miles replied, his voice rough from disuse. "City fellow, shot." June's expression darkened. "Dr. Clark," she said. "Arrived yesterday. I've been waiting for you." "For me?" Miles frowned. "I don't know any Dr. Clark." "Not specifically you," June clarified. "Just someone who might help." She gestured toward the back room. "Better come see for yourself." Miles followed June through the store, past shelves stocked with supplies and the pelts and goods waiting to be transported to larger markets when the weather broke. She led him to a small storeroom at the back, unlocked the door, and stepped aside for Miles to enter. At first he saw nothing but crates and barrels in the dimly lit space. Then movement caught his eye, a small figure huddled in the corner. A child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with a tangle of fiery red hair. She sat in a crudely constructed wooden wheelchair, her thin legs covered with a ragged blanket. Her eyes, a startling clear blue, stared at Miles without emotion or recognition. "Found her 3 days ago," June said quietly. "Man named Silas Reed left her. Said he'd be back, but I know a lie when I hear one. Dr. Clark arrived yesterday, said he'd been looking for a red-haired girl. Was going to take her somewhere safe, but..." She gestured vaguely toward the woods where the doctor's body lay. Miles stood frozen, staring at the child. Something about her vacant eyes, about the defenseless tilt of her small shoulders, reached into his chest and squeezed with painful familiarity. "She doesn't speak," June continued. "Doesn't eat much. Won't tell me her name." "What about Sheriff Cooper?" Miles asked. June snorted. "Franklin says it's not his problem. Says she'd be better off at the orphanage in Helena when the pass clears in spring." She looked at Miles meaningfully. "That's a death sentence for a crippled girl, and we both know it." Miles felt the weight of June's unspoken question. He took a step back, shaking his head. "June, I can't. I don't—" "You're the only one I can ask," June interrupted. "Doctor's dead. Sheriff won't help. None of the other folk around here will take her. You've got space, and you're—" She hesitated. "I'm what?" Miles challenged. "You're a good man, despite how hard you try to forget it." Miles closed his eyes briefly, unwanted memories washing over him. A Boston townhouse filled with music and laughter. Margaret at the piano, her dark hair falling over her shoulders as she played. Victoria, their 5-year-old daughter, dancing around the room with ribbons in her golden curls. And then, fire. Screams. The telegram that had reached him too late as he toured with the orchestra in New York. He opened his eyes, looking again at the red-haired child in the wheelchair. Taking her would mean breaking the careful isolation he'd built, would mean responsibility and connection, the very things he'd fled from. "I can't replace what you lost," June said softly, reading his thoughts. "No one can, but maybe you need her as much as she needs you." Miles approached the girl slowly, kneeling before her wheelchair. Up close, he could see the freckles scattered across her pale face, the chapped condition of her lips, the wariness beneath the emptiness in her eyes. "Hello?" he said awkwardly. The girl didn't respond, didn't even blink. "What happened to her legs?" Miles asked June. "Don't know for certain. Reed said something about a fall, but I don't trust a word from that snake. She can move them a little, but can't stand or walk." Miles sighed heavily, knowing he was already lost. "I'll need supplies, food clothes for her, and I'll need help getting that wheelchair up the mountain." June's face softened with relief. "I've got some things set aside already, and I can lend you my sled." As June gathered supplies, Miles noticed a leather satchel in the corner of the storeroom. "That the doctor's?" June nodded. "Brought it in before he went looking for you. Didn't want to leave it with the girl." Miles opened it, finding a notebook filled with cramped handwriting, several medical instruments, and a folded newspaper clipping about missing children in the Chicago area. He took the notebook, thinking it might contain information about the girl or why someone had wanted the doctor dead. Dawn was breaking by the time Miles had fashioned a conveyance that could transport the girl and her wheelchair up the mountain trails. He'd modified June's sled, creating a secure platform where the wheelchair could be fastened with blankets tucked around the child to protect her from the biting cold. Sheriff Franklin Cooper arrived as they prepared to depart. He was a heavy-set man with a perpetually suspicious expression and a badge that seemed too small for his chest. "Heard about the doctor," he said, eyeing Miles and the girl. "And I see you're taking our little visitor." "You planning to stop me?" Miles asked evenly. Cooper shook his head. "No, but I should warn you. That child came in with Silas Reed. You know his reputation." Miles had heard stories smuggling extortion worse. "Reed doesn't let go of what he considers his," Cooper continued. "And he was mighty interested in keeping that girl." "Then he shouldn't have abandoned her," Miles replied. Cooper nodded thoughtfully. "Watch your back, Abernathy. Reed's got friends in places you wouldn't expect." He looked pointedly at the girl. "And enemies who'd kill for whatever secret she's carrying." As Cooper walked away, June pressed a small package into Miles's hands. "Doctor's notebook," she said. "Might help you understand what's happening. Be careful, Miles." The journey back to his cabin was slow and arduous. The sled moved heavily through the fresh snow, and Miles had to stop frequently to check on the girl. She remained silent, her blue eyes taking in the forest around them, with neither fear nor wonder. By mid-afternoon, they reached a clearing beside a frozen stream. Miles paused to rest and prepare a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits. He offered some to the girl, who took it with thin fingers but didn't eat until Miles had taken his first bite. As they sat in silence, Miles found himself studying her. There was something familiar about the set of her jaw, the thoughtful furrow of her brow, as she looked at the snow-covered landscape. It reminded him painfully of Victoria. Suddenly, a sound drifted through the trees. The girl was humming. Very softly, almost below the threshold of hearing, but unmistakably, a melody. Miles froze, listening intently. The tune was simple, haunting, reminiscent of a lullaby. Then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped, and the girl's face returned to its blank mask. "You like music," Miles said, not really expecting a response. The girl didn't answer, but something flickered in her eyes, a momentary spark of connection that vanished almost immediately. They reached the cabin as dusk approached. Miles helped the girl inside the wheelchair, barely fitting through the doorway. The cabin was simple, but solid. One large room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping area sectioned off by a curtain, a table and chairs he'd made himself, shelves lined with the few books he'd brought from his previous life. The girl's eyes moved around the space, lingering on the rafters where Miles stored his traps and tools, the pelts hanging on the walls, the worn rug before the hearth. When her gaze reached a particular corner, she went very still. Miles followed her line of sight. There, gathering dust in the corner where he'd placed it 17 years ago and never touched since, stood his violin case. Something about the intensity of the girl's stare made Miles uncomfortable. He busied himself building up the fire, arranging a sleeping space for the girl near the warmth. As darkness fell outside, the cabin grew cozy with firelight. "You should sleep," Miles told the girl, helping her from the wheelchair onto the bedding he'd prepared. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out, well, everything else." That night, Miles lay awake long after the girl had fallen asleep. The steady rhythm of her breathing punctuated the familiar sounds of the cabin. The crack of the fire, the occasional settling of logs, the distant howl of a wolf. Her presence filled the space in a way he hadn't anticipated, making him acutely aware of the years of silence he'd accumulated. Miles rose quietly and moved to the table where he'd placed Dr. Clark's notebook. By firelight, he began to read, finding detailed notes about children with unusual abilities, references to experiments, and mentions of the Sullivan girl, who possessed extraordinary eidetic recall. Several pages had been torn out, leaving gaps in the narrative. A sound drew his attention. The girl was whimpering in her sleep, her face contorted in fear. Miles hesitated, unsure how to comfort her. Before he could decide, her eyes flew open, darting around the cabin in panic until they settled on him. For a moment, they stared at each other across the firelit room. Then the girl's gaze shifted again to the violin in the corner. Against his better judgment, Miles crossed to the corner and lifted the case, bringing it to the table. He hadn't opened it since the day he'd arrived in Montana, since the day he'd sworn never to make music again. He ran his fingers over the latches, hesitating. The girl had pushed herself up on her elbows, watching him with an intensity that seemed to hold her breath suspended. Miles opened the case. Inside lay his violin, once the pride of his existence, the instrument that had earned him a place in Boston's most prestigious orchestra. Its polished surface reflected the firelight, seemingly untouched by the years. With hands that trembled slightly, Miles lifted it from its velvet nest. The familiar weight settled against his shoulder as if returning home. He raised the bow, drew a single note. The sound filled the cabin, rich and pure, cutting through 17 years of silence. Miles closed his eyes, feeling the vibration travel through him. When he opened them again, he found the girl's expression transformed. Her eyes were wide and alive, her lips parted in wonder, her whole body leaning toward the music, as if drawn by an invisible thread. The emptiness had vanished, replaced by a hunger so fierce it was almost painful to witness. Miles continued playing a simple melody at first. Then something more complex, a piece by Bach he'd once performed to standing ovations. His fingers were stiff, unpracticed, but the music came back to him like a language he'd only forgotten in dreams. When he finally lowered the violin, the silence seemed to ring with echoes. The girl was sitting fully upright now, her eyes shining with tears. "Please," she whispered, her voice raspy with disuse. "Play more." Miles felt something crack inside him, a fissure in the wall he'd built around his heart. He raised the violin again and began to play a lullaby, one Margaret had composed for Victoria when she was small. As the last notes faded, the girl spoke again. "My name is Ruby," she said. Miles knotted his throat too tight for words. "I'm Miles," he finally managed. "I know," Ruby replied. "The doctor told me about you. He said you would help me." Before Miles could ask what she meant, Ruby's eyes drifted closed, exhaustion claiming her. Miles returned the violin to its case, his mind racing with questions. How had the doctor known about him? What connection could there possibly be? He glanced at the sleeping child, at the vibrant red hair spread across the pillow, and felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. Whatever secrets she carried, whatever danger followed her, he had made his choice when he brought her to his cabin. Miles Abernathy, who had fled from connection for 17 years, who had built his life around the absence of obligation, found himself standing guard over a child who had reawakened music in his silent world. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering their tracks, burying the past beneath its clean white blanket. The following days established a cautious routine. Miles rearranged his cabin to accommodate Ruby's wheelchair, building a ramp at the door, lowering shelves so she could reach them, creating spaces where she could maneuver independently. His hands, long accustomed to crafting traps and functional items, rediscovered the precision of his craftsman days. Ruby remained mostly silent, speaking only in response to direct questions, and sometimes not even then. But Miles noticed how her eyes followed him, absorbing every detail of their shared space, cataloging his movements with careful attention. It was the violin that drew her out. Each evening, Miles would play, and Ruby would listen with that same fierce concentration, sometimes humming along to melodies she'd heard only once. Her musical memory was extraordinary, perfect recall of every note, every phrase. One morning, about a week after her arrival, Miles was chopping wood outside when he heard music coming from inside the cabin. He set down his axe and moved quietly to the window. Ruby sat in her wheelchair by the table, the violin awkwardly positioned on her small shoulder. Her technique was rudimentary, but she was playing the Bach piece he'd performed that first night note for note. Miles watched, astonished. He'd never taught her, had never even shown her how to hold the instrument. Yet she mimicked what she'd seen with surprising accuracy. He entered the cabin, and Ruby immediately stopped, looking guilty. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, trying to return the violin to its case. "I shouldn't have touched it." "No, it's all right," Miles reassured her, crossing to her side. "You play beautifully." Ruby looked skeptical. "It doesn't sound like when you play." "That's because I've had years of practice. But you have a gift, Ruby, a remarkable gift." Something like pride flickered across her face, quickly replaced by wariness. "He said that too, that I was special." "Who said that, Dr. Clark?" Ruby nodded, then looked away. "And the other man, the one with the black glove." Miles felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Silas Reed." Ruby's shoulders hunched at the name. "He gets angry when people don't do what he wants. He hurt the doctor. He'll hurt you too, if he finds me here." "No one's going to hurt either of us," Miles said, though he knew it might be a promise he couldn't keep. "You're safe now." Ruby looked at him with eyes too old for her young face. "No one's safe from the man with the black glove," she whispered. That afternoon, Miles examined the wheelchair more carefully. It was crudely constructed, the wheels uneven, the seat uncomfortable. Using tools he'd once employed to craft fine furniture in Boston, he began making adjustments, smoothing rough edges, balancing the wheels, adding a cushion stuffed with dried moss. "You're good at fixing things," Ruby observed, watching him work. "I used to make furniture," Miles told her, "before I came to the mountains." "And you played violin?" Ruby added. "In Boston, with lots of people listening." Miles looked up sharply. "How do you know that?" "The doctor told me. He knew all about you." Miles set down his tools, giving Ruby his full attention. "Ruby, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Dr. Clark. It's important." Ruby's brow furrowed in concentration. "He came to the place where they kept me. He wore glasses and had kind eyes. He showed me pictures of music notes and asked if I could remember them. Then he said he knew someone who could help me, a man who lived in the mountains, who used to play music in Boston." "And did he say why he was looking for me specifically?" Ruby shook her head. "Just that you would understand, that you would help, because you knew what it was like to lose something important." The words struck Miles like a physical blow. How could Clark have known about his loss? Few people in Montana knew his history. He'd made sure of that when he arrived. "Ruby, do you remember your parents, your home before Silas Reed?" A shadow passed over Ruby's face. "I remember a big house with a piano, and a garden where birds came in spring." She hesitated. "Sometimes I dream about a woman singing. I think she might be my mother." That night, unable to sleep, Miles returned to Clark's notebook. Reading more carefully now, he found references to the Sullivan case, apparently a wealthy Chicago family whose daughter had been kidnapped 3 years earlier. The girl, described as having remarkable auditory recall, had vanished without a trace, despite a substantial reward offered for her return. Could Ruby be this Sullivan child? The timeline matched her apparent age, and certainly her musical abilities were extraordinary. But if so, why had she been brought to Montana? Why had Clark been killed trying to find her? The notebook contained other disturbing elements, mentions of children with unusual mental abilities being acquired for study references to experiments with memory and cognition. Several passages discussed conditioning techniques that made Miles's blood run cold. Near the back of the notebook, Miles found a folded newspaper clipping about Dr. Oscar Whitman, a Boston physician pioneering musical therapy for traumatized children. The article was dated 1857, the year Miles had lost everything. As he stared at the yellowed paper, a memory surfaced, Margaret mentioning a colleague who believed music could heal damaged minds. "Oscar thinks we might be able to reach children who've retreated into silence," she'd said excitedly over breakfast one morning. "Imagine Miles using Bach to bring a child back from darkness." Miles closed the notebook, his mind whirling with connections he couldn't quite grasp. What did Margaret's work from 17 years ago have to do with a kidnapped child from Chicago? How had Clark known to look for him? And most importantly, who was still hunting Ruby? A noise from outside interrupted his thoughts, the distant crack of a branch breaking under weight. Miles moved silently to the window, scanning the moonlit clearing around the cabin. Nothing moved among the snow-laden pines, yet the hairs on his neck stood at attention. He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded, then positioned it near the door. Whatever was coming, he would be ready. The next morning, Miles found fresh tracks in the snow, multiple sets circling the cabin at a distance. When he followed them, they led into the forest before disappearing among the trees. Someone had been watching them. When he returned, Ruby was awake, sitting by the window with the violin in her lap. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked quietly. Instead of answering directly, Miles said, "I need to teach you something, Ruby, in case of trouble." He showed her how to hide in the storage space beneath the floorboards, a small cellar he'd dug his first year for keeping food cool in summer. "If I ever tell you to hide, this is where you go. You stay quiet no matter what you hear. Understand?" Ruby nodded solemnly. "Like the shed at Mr. Reed's house. When bad men came, he would lock me in the shed." Miles felt a surge of anger at the casual way she mentioned this cruelty. "No, not like that. This isn't punishment, Ruby. This is to keep you safe. And I will always, always come back for you." The intensity of his promise surprised even him. He'd spent 17 years ensuring he had no one to come back for, no one who depended on him. Yet here he was, pledging himself to this child's safety with a fierceness that felt like waking up after a long sleep. That afternoon, Miles decided they needed to know more. Despite the risk, he would have to leave Ruby briefly to visit June Sawyer and learn what rumors had reached Pinewood. "I'll be back before dark," he promised Ruby, making sure she had food, water, and the violin within reach. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me." The journey to Pinewood seemed longer than usual, each step taking him farther from Ruby, making him increasingly anxious. Miles hadn't realized how quickly the girl had become the center of his world. How much his instinct to protect her had reawakened parts of himself he'd thought long dead. Pinewood was unusually busy when he arrived. A supply wagon had made it through despite the winter conditions, bringing goods and mail from Helena. June was serving coffee to several travelers when Miles entered, but she immediately excused herself and gestured for him to follow her to a back room. "Wondered when you'd show up," she said, closing the door behind them. "How's the girl?" "Her name is Ruby," Miles said, "and she's doing better. Speaking some. But June, someone's been watching my cabin." June's expression darkened. Reed's been asking questions. Came through 3 days ago with some rough-looking men. Wanted to know where the doctor had gone if he'd taken the girl. What did you tell him? Nothing useful. But he's not a fool, Miles. He knows there aren't many places she could be. Miles ran a hand through his mirror. I need to know what I'm dealing with. Who is Silas Reed, really? June sighed heavily. Stories say he runs a smuggling operation between Canada and the States. But I've heard worse, that he deals in people, not just goods, especially children. Miles felt sick. Human trafficking. June nodded grimly. The vulnerable ones. Orphans mostly, but sometimes children taken from their families. Word is, he has connections with wealthy buyers who want specific types. Like a girl with extraordinary musical memory, Miles said quietly. Perhaps. June studied him. You've learned something about her. Miles hesitated, then shared what he'd pieced together from Clark's notebook and Ruby's fragmented memories. I think she might be the daughter of a wealthy Chicago family named Sullivan, kidnapped 3 years ago. June's eyes widened. Lord above, if that's true, they'd pay handsomely to get her back. Which might be why Reed is so desperate to find her, Miles agreed. But there's something else, June. Clark's notebook mentioned experiments children with special abilities. And there was a connection to Boston to a doctor Margaret once worked with. Your wife. How could she be connected to this? I don't know. But it can't be coincidence. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the trading post's main room. Miles opened the door slightly, peering through the crack. Sheriff Cooper had arrived and was speaking with one of the travelers, a distinguished-looking man in a city coat. June, Miles whispered. Who's that with Cooper? June looked. Don't know. Arrived with the supply wagon. Been asking about a missing girl. Miles felt a surge of hope. Could be from the Sullivan family. I should speak with him. June caught his arm. Wait, something's not right. Cooper's too friendly with him. And remember what the sheriff said about Reed having friends in unexpected places. Miles hesitated, watching the interaction. The stranger handed Cooper what appeared to be a telegram, and the sheriff nodded with unusual deference. I need to get back to Ruby, Miles decided. If that man is legitimate, he'll still be here tomorrow. If not, be careful, June warned. Cooper's been acting strangely since the doctor was killed, almost like he's waiting for something. As Miles prepared to leave, June pressed a package into his hands. Supplies for the girl, and something else you might need. Inside, Miles found a small revolver. It was my husband's, June explained. I've kept it loaded since Reed came asking questions. The journey back to the cabin seemed to take an eternity. The short winter day was already fading to dusk shadows lengthening across the snow. Miles kept off the main trail, moving through the trees, alert for signs of followers. As he neared the cabin, he stopped abruptly. Something was wrong. The chimney, which should have been sending up smoke, was dark against the evening sky. Had Ruby let the fire die out, Miles approached cautiously, rifle ready. The clearing was empty, the cabin still. No tracks marred the snow except his own from earlier. Ruby, he called, pushing open the door. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, fire-banked but still warm, Ruby's half-eaten lunch on the table. But the girl herself was gone. The violin lay on the floor as if dropped suddenly. Miles's heart pounded as he searched the small space. Ruby, he called again, checking the hiding place beneath the floorboards. Empty. Then he noticed it. The small back window was unlatched, swinging slightly in the breeze. Someone had taken her, and they'd known exactly where to look. Miles was gathering supplies for pursuit when he heard a noise outside, footsteps approaching through snow. He positioned himself beside the door, rifle raised. The door creaked open, and a small figure appeared, bundled against the cold. Ruby, her red hair covered by a woolen cap, her face flushed with cold. "Ruby?" Miles dropped his rifle and knelt before her. "Where were you? I thought—" "I saw him," Ruby interrupted, her voice urgent. "The man with the black glove. He was watching the cabin." Miles helped her inside, checking her for injuries. How did you get out without being seen?" "After you left. I was playing violin by the window and saw him in the trees." Ruby's words came rapidly now, her usual reticence forgotten in urgency. "I remembered what you said about hiding, but I was afraid he'd come in and find the hiding place. So I went out the back window and hid in the hollow log where you keep extra firewood." Miles marveled at her resourcefulness even as fear gripped him. "Did he see you? Did he enter the cabin?" Ruby shook her head. "He just watched for a long time. Then another man came and they talked. I couldn't hear everything, but the new man said, 'Tomorrow night,' and 'The girl is worth more alive.'" Miles felt cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. Ruby listened carefully. "Did you recognize the second man? Was it Sheriff Cooper?" Ruby's eyes widened. "How did you know?" Miles cursed under his breath. Cooper and Reed working together explained much why the sheriff had been so unconcerned about Clark's murder, why he'd been so interested in Miles taking Ruby. "We need to leave," Miles decided. "It's not safe here anymore." As Miles gathered supplies, his hand brushed against an old wooden box tucked beneath his bed. He rarely opened it. The contents were reminders of a life he'd left behind, memories carefully preserved yet seldom revisited. Something about Ruby's presence, about the strangeness of the doctor's notebook, compelled him to pull it out now. Inside lay the few treasures he'd brought from Boston Margaret's locket. A dried flower from Victoria's first bouquet, a program from his final concert. Beneath these, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was a brass pocket watch. Miles unwrapped it carefully, the metal cool against his calloused palm. He ran his thumb over the engraving on the back, "To William Abernathy, M.D., for service above Self Boston Medical Society, 1843. His father's watch. A brilliant doctor, a stern but fair parent dead before Miles had truly known the man. William Abernathy had been respected throughout Boston for his innovative research, though Miles had never fully understood his father's work. Margaret had once asked about the watch, had held it with a curious reverence that Miles hadn't thought much of at the time. He snapped the case closed, returning it to the box. What connection could there possibly be between his father's medical career in Boston decades ago and a kidnapped child in Montana? The notion was absurd, yet the doctor's notes had mentioned the Abernathy connection specifically. Miles pushed the box back under the bed, troubled by questions he couldn't answer. For now, Ruby's immediate needs were more pressing than ghosts from his past. "What's that?" Ruby asked, her observant eyes having missed nothing. "Just old memories," Miles replied, surprised by his reluctance to elaborate. "Things from before, from Boston." Ruby nodded, accepting his vague answer with the practicality of a child who understood that adults kept their own secrets. But her gaze lingered on the spot where the box had disappeared, as if she sensed its importance to the puzzle they were both part of. "Where will we go?" Ruby asked, fear evident in her voice. Miles considered their options. They couldn't go to Pinewood, not with Cooper involved. The nearest town was 2 days' hard travel in good weather, impossible with Ruby in winter conditions. "There's a line cabin about 5 miles north," he said finally. "A place I use sometimes when trapping. They won't look for us there." As Miles gathered essentials, food blankets, his rifle, and June's revolver, Ruby watched with solemn eyes. "Miles," she said quietly, "are you sending me away back to Chicago?" Miles paused in his preparations, struck by the vulnerability in her question. "Is that where you want to go? Back to your family?" Ruby looked down at her hands. "I don't remember them. Not really. Just feelings sometimes. Music." She raised her eyes to his. "I remember you playing violin better than I remember my own mother's face. Is that wrong?" Miles knelt beside her wheelchair. "No, Ruby. It's not wrong. Memory is strange, especially when bad things happen." He took her small hand in his. "I'm not sending you away. I'm trying to keep you safe. And then we'll find your family together, if that's what you want." Ruby nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Can we take the violin?" "Of course." As Miles continued preparations, Ruby wheeled herself to the corner where he kept a trunk of personal items. "Miles," she called. "What's this?" She held a small enameled box, Margaret's jewelry box, which Miles hadn't opened since arriving in Montana. He crossed to Ruby, taking the box gently. "It belonged to my wife," he said. "Margaret." "Can I see inside?" Miles hesitated, then nodded, opening the lid. Inside lay Margaret's few pieces of jewelry, a pearl necklace, a cameo brooch, her wedding ring, and beneath them a folded piece of sheet music. "What's that?" Ruby asked, pointing to the music. Miles removed it carefully, unfolding the yellowed paper. The title read, "Victoria's Lullaby," in Margaret's elegant handwriting. "A song my wife wrote for our daughter," Miles said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd forgotten it was here." Ruby studied the notes intently. "Can you play it?" "Not now. We need to leave before dark." Ruby continued looking at the music, her lips moving silently as if she were hearing it in her mind. Then she began to hum the melody perfectly, note for note, though she'd never heard it played. Miles stared at her, astonished. "How did you do that?" "I can see the music," Ruby explained simply. "In my head, like pictures." Miles remembered Clark's notes about extraordinary eidetic recall and felt a chill. This was why Reed wanted her, why someone had killed Clark to keep her hidden. Ruby's mind was extraordinary in ways that went beyond normal talent. "We need to go," Miles said, helping Ruby into her coat. "I'll have to carry you. The wheelchair won't work in the deep snow." As they left the cabin, darkness was falling in earnest. Miles carried Ruby on his back, her thin arms wrapped around his neck while managing a pack with their essentials. He moved carefully through the trees, avoiding the trail, listening for sounds of pursuit. Ruby remained silent, her breath warm against his neck, trusting him completely. The weight of that trust bore down on Miles with each step. For 17 years he'd been responsible for no one but himself. Now this child's life depended on his decisions, his knowledge of the wilderness, his ability to outwit men who would harm her. As the first stars appeared overhead, Miles made a silent promise to the child on his back. He would keep her safe, whatever the cost. And in doing so, perhaps find redemption for his failure to save his own family all those years ago. The line cabin appeared as a darker shadow among the trees, a simple one-room structure built for shelter during extended trapping expeditions. Miles had stocked it with basic supplies during the fall, never imagining he would need it as a refuge. Once inside, he quickly built a fire in the small stone fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He settled Ruby on a bed of pine boughs covered with a blanket, making her as comfortable as possible. "We'll stay here until I figure out our next move," he told her, melting snow for drinking water. "Try to get some sleep." Ruby didn't argue, exhaustion evident in her pale face, but as Miles tucked the blanket around her, she caught his hand. "Will you play Victoria's lullaby for me?" she asked. "When we're safe." Miles felt his throat tighten. "Yes," he promised. "When we're safe." As Ruby drifted to sleep, Miles kept watch by the cabin's single-window rifle across his knees. Outside, the moon cast blue shadows across the snow, the forest standing silent witness to their flight. In the distance, a wolf howled a lonely sound that matched the ache in Miles's heart. Somehow, in the space of just 2 weeks, this child had broken through the walls he'd built around his grief. She'd brought music back into his silent world, had made him feel something beyond mere survival for the first time in 17 years. And Miles knew with absolute certainty that he would die before he let anyone take her away. Dawn broke slowly over the Montana wilderness gray light, filtering through the single window of the line cabin. Miles hadn't slept, maintaining his vigil through the night, listening for sounds beyond the whisper of wind in the pines and the occasional crack of branches beneath their burden of snow. Ruby still slept, her small form curled beneath blankets, red hair splayed across the makeshift pillow. In sleep, her face softened the wariness that seemed permanently etched into her features, temporarily erased. Miles watched her breathe, marveling at how quickly this child had become the center of his world. He moved quietly to add wood to the dying fire, his joints stiff from the night's immobility. The notebook of Dr. Clark lay open beside him, its pages containing more questions than answers. Miles had spent the darkest hours of the night poring over the cramped handwriting, seeking connections between Ruby's extraordinary abilities, the Sullivan family of Chicago, and somehow impossibly his own past life in Boston. One passage had kept him returning, reading it over and over, as if repetition might unlock its meaning. Subject demonstrates perfect recall of musical compositions after single exposure. Potential applications extend beyond mere performance. Thus theories about encoded information may prove correct. The Abernathy connection remains our best hope. The Abernathy connection. His name there in black and white. But what connection Miles had left Boston 17 years ago had severed all ties with his previous life. How could he possibly be linked to a child kidnapped in Chicago just 3 years earlier? Ruby stirred, her eyes opening with the immediate alertness of someone accustomed to danger. No gradual awakening, no sleepy confusion. She was instantly aware of her surroundings, gaze, finding Miles with a question in their blue depths. "We're safe," he assured her. "No one followed us." Ruby pushed herself to a sitting position, wincing slightly as she moved her legs. Miles had noticed she experienced pain in the mornings, though she rarely complained. "Are your legs hurting?" he asked, moving to her side. Ruby nodded reluctantly. "They're always stiff when I wake up." Miles hesitated, then asked, "May I?" gesturing toward her legs. When Ruby nodded, he gently began massaging her thin calves through the blanket, using techniques he remembered Margaret employing for muscle cramps. "What happened to them, Ruby? Do you remember the accident?" Ruby's face closed like a door shutting. "It wasn't an accident," she said quietly. "Mr. Reed pushed me down the stairs when I tried to run away. He said if I couldn't walk, I couldn't escape again." Miles felt a surge of rage so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. He continued the gentle massage, struggling to keep his hands steady, to not let Ruby see the murderous thoughts racing through his mind. "He'll pay for that," Miles finally said, his voice controlled. "For that and everything else he did to you." Ruby studied his face. "You're angry," she observed. "Yes, but not at me. Never at you, Ruby." She seemed to consider this, then nodded, accepting his answer. "I'm hungry," she said, changing the subject with the practicality of a child who had learned to focus on immediate needs. They shared a simple breakfast of jerky and hardtack from Miles's supplies. As they ate, Miles considered their next move. They couldn't stay in the line cabin indefinitely. Their supplies would run out, and eventually Reed would expand his search beyond the main cabin. "Ruby," Miles said carefully, "I need to ask you some questions about your life before Montana. It might help us figure out what to do next." Ruby's shoulders tensed, but she nodded. "Dr. Clark's notes mention a family named Sullivan from Chicago. Does that name mean anything to you?" Ruby frowned in concentration. "Sometimes I dream about a woman calling that name. Ruby Sullivan come inside now, but I don't know if it's real or something I made up." "What about your parents? Do you remember their faces?" Ruby shook her head. "Just feelings. My mother smelled like flowers. My father was tall." She paused. "They had a piano in a room with big windows. My mother would play, and I would sit beside her." "And how did you come to be with Silas Reed?" Ruby's expression darkened. "Men came to our house at night. They wore masks. There was shouting and someone carried me out wrapped in a blanket. I couldn't see, but I could hear." She stopped, her breathing quickening. "I don't want to remember more." Miles reached across the small space between them, taking her hand. "That's enough for now. You're very brave, Ruby." They fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the cabin. Then, unexpectedly, Ruby spoke again. "Why don't you play violin anymore? Before the mountain?" The question caught Miles off guard. "How did you know I stopped playing?" "Your fingers," Ruby said, simply pointing to his hands. "They have calluses from trapping and woodwork, but not from violin strings." "Those are new again." Miles marveled at her observational skills. "You're right. I stopped playing when I came to Montana." "Why?" Miles looked into the fire, considering how much to tell her. Ruby waited patiently, seeming to understand the weight of her question. "I had a family once," he finally said. "A wife, Margaret, and a daughter, Victoria. Margaret was a pianist, a music teacher. Victoria was 5, just learning to play herself." He paused, gathering strength. "There was a fire while I was away performing. By the time I received word and returned to Boston, they were gone. The house, everything, gone." Ruby's small hand tightened around his. "So you came here to be alone?" "Yes. I couldn't bear to make music without them. It felt wrong." Ruby considered this with a solemnity beyond her years. "But now you play for me." "Yes," Miles agreed, somewhat surprised by the realization. "Now I play for you." Ruby's eyes, usually so guarded, softened with understanding. "Maybe they wanted you to find the music again. Your family." Miles felt a tightness in his throat. "Maybe they did." And the moment was interrupted by a sound outside, the distant crunch of snow under boots. Miles was on his feet, instantly motioning for Ruby to be silent. He moved to the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the crude shutters. A solitary figure approached through the trees, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying to be quiet. Miles recognized the heavy sheepskin coat and wide-brimmed hat, Sheriff Franklin Cooper. Miles grabbed his rifle, checking that it was loaded. "Stay here," he whispered to Ruby. "If anything happens to me, hide under the floorboards by the hearth. There's a loose board that lifts up." Ruby's face had gone pale, but she nodded, her eyes huge in her small face. Miles positioned himself beside the door, waiting as Cooper's footsteps drew closer, then stopped on the cabin's small porch. There was a moment of silence, then a soft knock. "Abernathy," Cooper's voice came through the door, pitched low. "It's Cooper." I'm alone. Miles remained silent, rifle ready. I know you're in there, Cooper continued. And I know about the girl. We need to talk. Talk through the door, Miles replied. Give me one reason not to shoot you where you stand. Cooper sighed audibly. Because I'm not working with Reed. Quite the opposite. Now open up before I freeze to death out here. Miles hesitated, then motioned for Ruby to move behind the small table where she'd be less visible. Any sudden moves, and I'll put a bullet in you, he warned, then unbarred the door. Cooper entered, stomping snow from his boots, his gaze immediately taking in the cabin's interior and Ruby's partially concealed form behind the table. He removed his hat, revealing graying hair and a face lined with exhaustion. You can lower the rifle, he said to Miles. If I wanted to bring Reed down on you, I'd have done it already. You were with him yesterday, Miles said, not lowering his weapon. Ruby saw you. Cooper's eyes widened slightly as he looked at Ruby. You saw me at Abernathy's cabin. Ruby nodded, her expression wary. Cooper swore softly. You've got good eyes and better ears then. I was being careful. He turned back to Miles. Yes, I met with Reed. I've been pretending to work with him to learn his operation. Been tracking him for months. Why should I believe you? Miles demanded. Cooper reached slowly into his coat, freezing when Miles raised the rifle. Easy. I'm just getting something to show you. He withdrew a folded document, holding it out to Miles. My authorization from the federal marshals. I've been working with them to build a case against Reed and his organization. Miles took the paper with his free hand, keeping the rifle trained on Cooper. The document appeared official with government seals and signatures authorizing Franklin Cooper to assist in an investigation of trafficking operations in the Montana Territory. This could be forged, Miles said, though his conviction was wavering. It could be, Cooper agreed. But ask yourself this, if I were truly working with Reed, why come alone? Why not bring him and his men to overwhelm you? He gestured around the small cabin. This place isn't exactly a fortress. Miles lowered the rifle slightly. What do you want? Cooper removed his gloves, warming his hands by the fire. Information, primarily. I know the girl is important to Reed, important enough that he's been searching these mountains for 2 weeks in the dead of winter. I need to know why. Miles exchanged a glance with Ruby, who remained silent, watching Cooper with suspicious eyes. She has an unusual ability, Miles said carefully. Perfect recall, especially for music. Dr. Clark's notes suggest she might be the kidnapped daughter of a wealthy Chicago family named Sullivan. Cooper nodded thoughtfully. That fits with what we know. Reed's organization doesn't just smuggle goods, they deal in special commodities. Children with unusual talents or abilities sold to private collectors or researchers. People buy children? Ruby asked, her voice small but clear. Cooper looked uncomfortable. Bad people do, yes. That's why I've been trying to stop Reed. Then why did you let him abandon Ruby at the trading post? Miles challenged. Why not arrest him then? Because he's just one part of a larger network, Cooper explained. We call them the Black Glove. Reed is a collector, a mid-level operative. I need the names of his buyers, his contacts in Chicago and New York. Taking him alone wouldn't end the operation. Miles considered this, his suspicion gradually giving way to cautious belief. So what now? Reed knows Ruby is with me. He'll keep looking. Cooper nodded grimly. Yes, he will, but not immediately. I convinced him you'd likely headed toward Helena. He's sent men to watch the trails east. He looked at Ruby. That buys us a little time. Time for what? Miles asked. To get a message to Chicago. If she is indeed Ruby Sullivan, her family has resources that could help protect her. Cooper hesitated. And there's something else. A man arrived on yesterday's supply wagon, Dr. Oscar Whitman from Boston. He claims to be looking for his colleague, Dr. Clark. Miles felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath him. Whitman, are you certain of the name? Yes. Distinguished older gentleman, speaks like an educated Easterner. Says he's been tracking Clark for months. Miles's mind raced. Oscar Whitman, the very doctor mentioned in Clark's notes, the colleague Margaret had spoken of all those years ago. The connection he'd sensed was real, not imagined. I need to speak with him, Miles said decisively. That's why I'm here, Cooper replied. Whitman mentioned your name specifically, said Clark might have been coming to find you. Ruby, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. The kind man with glasses said the same thing, that Miles was important. Cooper studied Ruby with new interest. What else did Clark tell you, child? Ruby's brow furrowed in concentration. He showed me music with hidden messages. He said I was the only one who could read them because of how my mind works. She looked at Miles. Like Victoria's lullaby, the notes make pictures in my head. Miles remembered how Ruby had been able to hear the melody just by looking at the sheet music. What kind of messages, Ruby? Names, she said simply. Names of important men who work with Mr. Reed. The kind man said if anything happened to him, I should find you and show you the music. Cooper leaned forward. Do you remember these names, Ruby? Ruby nodded slowly. Some of them. There was a senator and a judge, and... She hesitated, glancing at Cooper. A marshal named Hollister. Cooper's face paled. James Hollister, the U.S. Marshal for the Montana Territory. Yes, that's why the kind man was scared. He said no one would believe him without proof. Miles and Cooper exchanged stunned looks. If Ruby was right, the corruption extended to the highest levels of law enforcement in the territory. No wonder Clark had been desperate to find an outsider he could trust. This changes everything, Cooper said grimly. If Hollister is involved, we can't trust the official channels. We need to get Ruby to safety and find concrete evidence against these men. What about Whitman? Miles asked. Can he be trusted? Cooper shook his head. I don't know. He seems legitimate, but so did Clark, and someone killed him. He stood, putting his hat back on. I need to return to Pinewood before my absence is noticed. Reed has men watching the trading post. What do you suggest we do? Miles asked. Stay here for now, Cooper advised. I'll bring supplies tomorrow, food, warm clothes for the girl, and I'll try to learn more about Whitman without raising suspicion. He looked at Ruby. Can you remember any other names from the music, child? Any other messages Clark shared? Ruby closed her eyes, her face taking on that intense concentration Miles had observed when she recalled music. There was another doctor, someone who works with children like me. His name was in the music, too. She opened her eyes, looking directly at Miles. Abernathy. Dr. William Abernathy from Boston. Miles felt as if he'd been struck. William Abernathy. Are you certain? Ruby nodded. The kind man said it was important, that you would understand. Miles sank onto a chair, his mind reeling. William Abernathy, his father's name. His father who had died when Miles was just 20, long before he met Margaret, long before Victoria was born. How could his father possibly be connected to all of this? Cooper looked between them, sensing the revelation's impact. I take it that name means something to you? William Abernathy was my father, Miles said quietly. He was a doctor in Boston, but he died over 30 years ago. Cooper whistled softly. Well, that's a twist I didn't see coming. He moved toward the door. "I'll return tomorrow. Keep the girl hidden and be ready to move if necessary." After Cooper left, Miles sat in stunned silence, staring into the fire. Ruby wheeled herself closer, her small hand coming to rest on his arm. "Are you angry?" she asked. Miles blinked, focusing on her concerned face. "No, just confused. My father died when I was young. I can't imagine how he could be connected to any of this." Ruby nodded, with the solemnity of a child accustomed to the incomprehensible machinations of adults. "The kind man Dr. Clark, he said, sometimes secrets stay hidden for generations. That's why the music was important. It keeps secrets safe until the right person can hear them." Miles studied her face, marveling again at the strange intelligence behind those clear blue eyes. "Ruby, how much do you remember about Dr. Clark's music codes? Could you recreate them?" Ruby considered this. "I think so. I need paper, though, and a pencil." Miles found a small notebook and pencil stub in his pack items he used to track his trap lines. He handed them to Ruby, who took them eagerly. For the next hour, Ruby worked intently, her small hand moving across the paper with surprising precision. Miles watched in amazement as she filled page after page with musical notation, occasionally pausing to close her eyes, as if hearing the music internally before continuing. "There," she said, finally handing the notebook to Miles. "That's what I remember." Miles examined the pages. To his untrained eye, it appeared to be a normal musical composition complex, certainly, but not obviously encoded with secret information. "How does the code work?" he asked. "It's in the patterns," Ruby explained, pointing to specific sequences of notes. "See how these form a shape, that's an H, and these make an O. It spells words, if you know how to look." Miles stared at the notation, trying to see the patterns Ruby described. He could almost grasp it, like seeing shapes in clouds that disappeared when examined too directly. "The kind man said only special people can see it properly," Ruby added, observing his struggle. "People like me whose minds work differently." She hesitated, then added, "He said your wife could see it too, that she helped make the code." Miles's head snapped up. "Margaret, my Margaret." Ruby nodded. "He said she was brilliant with music patterns, that she worked with your father before she died." Miles set the notebook down carefully, his hands trembling slightly. "Ruby, that's impossible. My father died years before I met Margaret, and she never mentioned knowing him or working with any code system." Ruby shrugged, the gesture heartbreakingly adult on her small frame. "I'm just telling you what he said." Miles rose and paced the small confines of the cabin, his mind racing. Could Margaret have had secrets he never knew about? She'd been a music teacher, yes, but also a talented composer, who sometimes collaborated with other musicians and researchers. Could she have known about his father's work somehow? Used it in her own research? And what of Clark's notes about W's theories on encoded information? W for Whitman. The same Whitman who had now appeared in Pinewood, supposedly looking for Clark. Too many questions, too few answers. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. Ruby was at the center of a web that somehow connected Miles's past in Boston with the present danger. And if his father and Margaret were somehow involved, he needed to understand how. "I think I need to meet this Dr. Whitman," Miles said finally. "He might have answers." Ruby's face filled with alarm. "No, the kind man said to be careful. He said some people would pretend to be friends, but weren't." "I'll be careful," Miles assured her. "But we need to know more if we're going to keep you safe." Ruby didn't appear convinced. "What if it's a trap? What if he works with Mr. Reed? Then Cooper will warn us," Miles replied. though he shared her uncertainty. Could Cooper truly be trusted? Or was his appearance at the line cabin part of a more elaborate deception? They spent the remainder of the day in watchful silence. Miles fashioned a crude pair of crutches for Ruby from pine branches, allowing her some mobility within the small cabin. She accepted them gratefully, practicing moving about with a determination that squeezed Miles's heart. Her legs were weak, but not entirely useless with proper medical care. Might she walk again someday? As evening approached, Miles prepared a simple meal from their dwindling supplies. Ruby watched him work, her expression thoughtful. "Miles," she said suddenly, "do you think my family is still looking for me after 3 years?" The question, asked with such vulnerable hope, caught Miles unprepared. He set aside the pot he was tending and moved to sit beside her. "Yes," he said firmly. "If you are indeed Ruby Sullivan, and if your parents are still alive, I believe they have never stopped looking for you. Not for a single day." Ruby absorbed this, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the rough wooden table. "I don't remember their faces," she admitted, her voice small with shame. "Sometimes I dream of a woman singing or a man laughing, but when I try to see them clearly, they disappear." "Memory is strange that way," Miles said gently. "Especially memories from when we're very young, or memories tied to frightening events." He hesitated, then added, "After Margaret and Victoria died, I found that some of my clearest memories of them were tied to music songs Margaret played, lullabies we sang to Victoria. Perhaps it's the same for you." Ruby nodded slowly. "The piano music. I remember that the most clearly." She looked up at Miles, her eyes suddenly bright with an idea. "Could you play it on your violin? Maybe it would help me remember." "I don't know the music your mother played, Ruby." "But I do," she insisted. "I can hear it. If I hum it, could you find it on your violin?" Miles hadn't brought his violin in their hasty flight from the cabin, but the idea took hold nonetheless. Music had always been the language his family shared most fluently. Perhaps it could indeed help Ruby reclaim her fragmented past. "When we return to the cabin," he promised, "we'll try. I'll play whatever you can remember." Ruby smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed her solemn face. "Thank you," she said simply. That night, as Ruby slept, Miles returned to Dr. Clark's notebook, reading it with new understanding. The references to W.'s theories likely meant Whitman, while the Abernathy connection referred either to his father or to Miles himself. But how had Clark known to look for him in Montana? How had he known about Miles's past in Boston, about his connection to Margaret? The most disturbing passages concerned experiments with children possessing unusual cognitive abilities. Clark described conditioning techniques used to enhance memory recall, musical perception, and pattern recognition. Reading between the lines, Miles sensed the doctor's growing unease with these methods, his ethical doubts about the research. Had Ruby been subjected to such experiments during her captivity? The thought filled Miles with rage and helplessness. What kind of man was Silas Reed to torture a child for profit, or twisted scientific curiosity? A soft sound drew Miles's attention. Ruby whimpering in her sleep, her face contorted in a nightmare. He moved quickly to her side, gently touching her shoulder. "Ruby," he called softly. "Wake up. You're safe." Her eyes flew open, wild with terror, until they focused on his face. "Miles," she gasped, reaching for him with trembling hands. Miles gathered her into his arms, her small body shaking with the aftermath of the dream. "It's all right," he murmured. "I'm here." "He was coming," Ruby whispered against his shoulder. "The man with the black glove. He was in the music, changing the notes, making them scream." Miles held her tighter, wishing he could shield her from the horrors in her mind as easily as he could shield her from physical danger. "He can't hurt you anymore," he promised. "I won't let him." Gradually, Ruby's trembling subsided. But she didn't release her grip on Miles, and he found himself unwilling to let her go. He shifted to sit more comfortably against the wall, cradling her as he'd once held Victoria during thunderstorms or after bad dreams. "Would you like me to sing to you?" he asked. The question surprised even him. He hadn't sung aloud since Victoria's death. Ruby nodded against his chest, and Miles began to sing softly the melody of Victoria's lullaby, coming back to him with painful clarity. Margaret had composed it during her pregnancy, had sung it every night of their daughter's short life. The words spoke of stars and dreams of love that watched over a sleeping child. As he sang, Miles felt Ruby relax in his arms, her breathing growing deeper and more regular. But he continued the lullaby to its end, each note a bridge between his past and present, between the daughter he'd lost and the child he'd found. When the song ended, Miles discovered his cheeks were wet with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. Ruby was asleep again, her face peaceful now. Carefully, he laid her back on her bed, tucking the blankets around her. "Sleep well, little one," he whispered. "I'll keep watch." Dawn was still hours away, but Miles knew he wouldn't sleep. Instead, he returned to the window, keeping vigil against the darkness, against the memories, against the mysterious forces that threatened the fragile peace he'd found in this unexpected connection with a lost child. The sound of approaching footsteps woke Miles from an unintended doze. He jerked upright, momentarily disoriented until his surroundings came into focus, the line cabin Ruby still sleeping. Gray morning light filtering through the window. He reached for his rifle, moving silently to the door. Multiple sets of footsteps crunched through the snow outside, too many for just Cooper returning with supplies. "Ruby," he whispered, urgently, crossing to shake her gently awake. "Someone's coming. We need to hide you." Ruby was instantly alert, allowing Miles to help her to the loose floorboard near the hearth. The space beneath was small and dark, but Ruby crawled in without hesitation, her trust in Miles evident in her unwavering gaze. "Stay completely silent," Miles instructed. "No matter what you hear, I'll come for you when it's safe." He replaced the floorboard just as a voice called from outside. "Abernathy, it's Cooper. I've brought Whitman. We need to talk." Miles positioned himself behind the door, rifle ready. "Enter slowly," he called. "Hands where I can see them." The door creaked open, and Cooper stepped inside, followed by an elderly gentleman in a city coat and spectacles. Miles kept his rifle trained on them as they entered, studying the stranger who could only be Dr. Oscar Whitman. He was tall and thin, perhaps 70 years old, with a neatly trimmed white beard and intelligent eyes behind round spectacles. He carried a leather medical bag and moved with the deliberate precision of age. "Mr. Abernathy," Whitman said, his voice cultured and firm despite his years. "I've been looking for you for a very long time." "So I've heard," Miles replied, not lowering his weapon. "What I don't understand is why." Whitman glanced around the cabin, his gaze lingering on the disturbed bedding where Ruby had slept. "Where is the child, Ruby Sullivan? What makes you think she's here? Please, Mr. Abernathy, time is of the essence. Reed's men discovered your empty cabin early this morning. They know you've fled with the girl. It won't take them long to find this place." Cooper nodded confirmation. "It's true. They're combing the mountains. We need to move quickly." Miles studied both men, weighing their words against Ruby's warnings. "Before I tell you anything, I need answers. How do you know my name? How are you connected to my father? To Margaret?" Whitman sighed heavily. "It's a long story, and as I said, time is short. But you deserve to know." He set his medical bag on the table. "May I sit? My old bones don't tolerate cold as they once did." Miles gestured with the rifle for him to take a seat, remaining standing himself. "I knew your father well," Whitman began. "William Abernathy was more than a colleague. He was my dearest friend. Together, we developed a theory about musical encoding, about how certain patterns of notes could be used to convey information in a way that only specific minds could interpret." "What kind of information?" Miles asked. "Initially, medical data, patient records that could be transported without risk of interception. But as our research progressed, we discovered something unexpected. Certain individuals could perceive these patterns intuitively without training. They saw or heard connections in the music that others couldn't." "People like Ruby," Miles said. Whitman nodded. "Precisely. Your father called it harmonic perception, a rare cognitive ability that allows the mind to process musical patterns as visual or linguistic information. He believed it was hereditary." Miles frowned. "I don't have this ability." "No, but Margaret did." Whitman's gaze was steady. "Your wife was one of our most gifted subjects in the early research. She came to us as a music student volunteering for what she thought was a simple study on musical memory. When we discovered her extraordinary abilities, she became integral to our work." Miles felt as if the ground were shifting beneath his feet. "Margaret never mentioned any of this." "She wouldn't have," Whitman said gently. "Our work was confidential, and later, after what happened after your father—" He hesitated. "After your father's death, the research took a darker turn. Margaret wanted no part of it. She left the program, changed her name, began a new life. Meeting you, I believe, was coincidental." "What darker turn?" Miles demanded. "What happened after my father died?" Whitman's expression grew troubled. "Others became interested in our research, government agencies, private entities with substantial resources. They saw potential applications beyond medicine. Coded communications, intelligence gathering." He spread his hands. "I was naive. I thought we were advancing science, helping people with unusual minds find purpose. I didn't realize until too late what some intended to do with our discoveries." "And what was that?" "To weaponize these children. To identify those with harmonic perception and other cognitive gifts, then train them as living code breakers, human encryption devices." Whitman looked down at his hands. "Your father discovered the plan. He threatened to expose everything. A week later, he was dead in an apparent heart attack." Whitman's expression darkened. What began as medical research evolved into something far more sinister. The military applications became apparent quickly. A child who could memorize detailed maps, after a single glance, decode enemy transmissions through musical patterns that conventional cryptographers couldn't break, or recall every word from diplomatic meetings without taking notes. "But it goes beyond military uses," Cooper interjected, leaning forward. "The Black Glove isn't just an organization. It's a shadow network with tendrils in government finance and law enforcement. They've placed children like Ruby in the households of powerful men, as servants, tutors, even adopted family members. Children who remember everything they hear and see, who can be retrieved months or years later with their memories intact." Whitman nodded grimly. "These children become unwitting spies. Think of it. A senator discusses classified information at his dinner table, never suspecting the quiet child serving his meal has a mind capable of retaining every word. A judge discusses a sensitive ruling in his study, while his young ward dusts the bookshelves. The possibilities for blackmail, manipulation, and control are endless. "And Ruby?" Miles asked, his voice tight. "Ruby's abilities are exceptional even by these standards," Whitman replied. "Her capacity to perceive musical encoding is the most advanced I've ever documented. The black glove likely intended her for their most sensitive operations. A child who can not only memorize music, but extract embedded messages from it could serve as the perfect courier for their most valuable intelligence." Cooper nodded. "That's why Reed has been so desperate to reclaim her. She's not just a valuable asset, she's proof of their entire operation. And if she's retained names, dates, locations from her time in captivity, she's the most dangerous witness imaginable." Miles finished, understanding blooming like ice in his veins. "A child with perfect recall who can testify to everything she's seen and heard." Miles felt cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You're saying my father was murdered?" "I couldn't prove it," Whitman said. "But yes, I believe so. I tried to continue his work ethically to protect the research from misuse, but others had different ideas. A program was developed, the Harmonic Initiative, to identify children with these special abilities." "The Black Glove," Cooper interjected. "That's what they call themselves now." Whitman nodded. "A fitting name for an organization that operates in shadows. They began recruiting children, sometimes legally, through adoption of orphans, sometimes—" he hesitated, "sometimes through more direct means." "Kidnapping," Miles said flatly. "Yes, Ruby Sullivan was one such child. Her parents, Thomas and Eleanor Sullivan, discovered her abilities when she was very young. Thomas, a music professor at Northwestern University, recognized what he was seeing and reached out to me for guidance. I advised them to keep Ruby's abilities secret, but somehow the Black Glove discovered her nonetheless. And Dr. Clark, how does he fit into this? Edmund was my student, and later my research partner. When children began disappearing, he infiltrated the Black Glove, posing as a researcher, sympathetic to their aims. He tracked several missing children, including Ruby. When he discovered she was being held in Montana, he contacted me immediately." "Why look for me?" Miles asked. "What could I possibly offer?" Whitman's gaze was steady. "Protection, for one thing. Your isolated location, your skills as a survivalist. But more importantly, connection. Clark believed Ruby would respond to you because of your musical background, because of Margaret's involvement in the original research. He thought you might be able to help Ruby recover memories that had been suppressed during her captivity." Miles considered this, the pieces slowly fitting together in his mind. "And the encoded music Ruby remembers, the names of powerful men involved with this Black Glove, Clark's insurance policy," Whitman confirmed. He knew the organization had connections at the highest levels. Without proof, no one would believe him. So he used our own research against them, teaching Ruby to encode the information in musical patterns that only she could fully interpret. Cooper, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Which is why Reed wants her back so desperately. She's not just a valuable commodity anymore, she's a threat to their entire operation." A sound from beneath the floorboards drew their attention, a soft sneeze quickly muffled. Miles moved instantly to the hearth, lifting the board to reveal Ruby huddled in the small space below, dust on her nose from her hiding place. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I couldn't help it." Miles helped her out, lifting her gently. "It's all right. How much did you hear?" "All of it," Ruby admitted. She looked at Whitman, studying him with careful attention. "You knew the kind man, Dr. Clark?" Whitman nodded, his expression softening. "I did, my dear. He was very concerned for your safety." Ruby continued to study him. He showed me your picture once. You were younger then. You had a dog named Aristotle. A smile broke across Whitman's lined face. Indeed, I did. A very clever spaniel who insisted on attending all my lectures. Ruby seemed to reach a decision. She looked at Miles. I think he's telling the truth. Miles had to smile at her solemn pronouncement. I'm inclined to agree. He turned to Cooper. So what now if Reed's men are searching? We can't stay here. Cooper moved to the window, checking outside. We need to get Ruby to safety, then gather evidence against the black glove. With Hollister involved, we can't trust regular channels. I have colleagues in Chicago, Whitman offered. People who have been helping me track these missing children. And Ruby's parents are still there, still searching for her. Chicago is hundreds of miles away, Miles pointed out. How do we get there in winter with Reed hunting us? Cooper considered this. The railroad at Helena. If we can reach it, we can get Ruby on a train east. That's at least 3 days hard travel, Miles said doubtfully, looking at Ruby. I don't think she could manage it. There's another option, Cooper said slowly. June Sawyer has a wagon with a false bottom. She uses it to help certain individuals evade the law. Former slaves, Chinese workers without papers. If Ruby could hide there, June could transport her to Helena on the supply run. Hiding a child from slave catchers is one thing, Miles said. Hiding her from Reed's organization is another. It's too risky. Perhaps, Whitman agreed. But remaining here is riskier still. Every hour increases the chance of discovery. Miles knew they were right, but the thought of entrusting Ruby's safety to anyone else, even June, filled him with dread. She had become his responsibility, his purpose. The idea of separation, even temporary, was almost physically painful. Ruby, sensing his hesitation, spoke up. I could do it, Miles. I'm good at being quiet and still. Miles knelt beside her. It would be dangerous, Ruby. Very dangerous. I know, she said simply. But you'll come find me after, won't you, in Chicago? The question struck Miles to his core. Would he? Could he leave the mountains that had been his refuge, return to the world he'd fled? For Ruby, perhaps he could. Yes, he promised. I'll find you. Their planning was interrupted by a distant sound that made Cooper stiffen, dogs barking far off, but drawing closer. Tracking hounds, Cooper said grimly. Reed must have brought them from his hunting lodge. Miles made his decision instantly. We need to split up. Cooper, take Ruby and head west toward the river. The water will mask her scent. Whitman and I will create a false trail east to draw the dogs away. Cooper nodded, already preparing. June's cabin is 3 miles downriver. If we can reach it, she can hide Ruby until the wagon is ready. Miles gathered their few supplies, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. He helped Ruby into her coat, wrapped an extra blanket around her shoulders, then knelt to look her in the eye. Remember what I taught you about staying hidden, he said. Do exactly as Cooper tells you. I'll find you as soon as it's safe. Ruby's blue eyes were wide with fear, but her chin was set with determination. I promise. Be careful, Miles. Impulsively, Miles pulled her into an embrace, holding her small form against his chest, as if he could imprint the feeling of her heartbeat alongside his own. I'll see you soon, little one. Cooper lifted Ruby easily, settling her on his back. We'll take the deer trail down to the river, he told Miles. Give us a 15-minute head start before you make your move. Miles nodded. Godspeed. As Cooper carried Ruby into the forest, Miles turned to find Whitman watching him with a thoughtful expression. What? Miles asked. "You've come to care deeply for the child," Whitman observed. "In a very short time. She needed someone," Miles said simply. "I was there." Whitman smiled slightly. "Margaret would be proud of you, I think. She always said you had a capacity for love that surprised even you." Miles felt a pang at the casual mention of his wife by this stranger who had apparently known her so well. "You said earlier that Margaret meeting me was coincidental. Do you truly believe that?" Whitman considered the question. "I believe she fell in love with you genuinely, if that's what you're asking. Margaret was never one for deception." He paused. "But I also believe there are no true coincidences in this life, Mr. Abernathy. Perhaps some part of her recognized in you a connection to the work that had once meant so much to her." The barking of the hounds grew louder, interrupting their conversation. "Time to move," Miles said, gathering his rifle and pack. "We need to leave a trail obvious enough to draw them away from the river." As they stepped outside into the cold morning air, Miles cast one last glance in the direction Cooper had taken with Ruby. A prayer formed in his mind, not to God whom he'd abandoned along with music 17 years ago, but to Margaret and Victoria, to the ghosts who had watched over his solitude all these years. "Keep her safe," he thought. "Let me find her again." Then Miles Abernathy, who had fled from connection and responsibility for nearly 2 decades, deliberately left tracks in the fresh snow, drawing danger toward himself and away from the child who had reawakened his heart. Miles and Whitman moved swiftly through the snow-laden forest, deliberately leaving a clear trail. The doctor, despite his age, kept pace surprisingly well, though his breathing grew labored on the steeper inclines. The barking of Reed's tracking hounds grew steadily louder behind them. "They're gaining," Whitman observed, pausing briefly to catch his breath. "Perhaps I should continue alone. I'm slowing you down." Miles shook his head. "We stay together. The plan only works if they follow both of us." That plan was simple but risky. Lead Reed's men on a chase long enough for Cooper to get Ruby safely to June's cabin. Then double back through a series of rocky outcroppings where they could move without leaving tracks, eventually circling around to Pinewood by nightfall. From there they would make their way to Helena and the railroad. The sun climbed higher as they pushed eastward, its weak winter light doing little to warm the frigid air. Miles kept them moving at a steady pace, neither so fast that Whitman couldn't maintain it, nor so slow that the pursuers would catch them too quickly. "Tell me about her," Whitman said suddenly as they paused to drink from a stream. "About Ruby." Miles cupped the icy water in his hands, considering the question. "She's remarkable," he said finally. "Perceptive, resilient. She sees and hears things others miss. And despite everything she's endured, there's still light in her." Whitman nodded thoughtfully. Clark believed her abilities were exceptional, even among children with harmonic perception. Not just memory, but a form of synesthesia, seeing sound as visual patterns, processing music as language. "Is that why they took her, the black glove?" "Partially, but I suspect there was more." Whitman glanced back the way they had come, the distant barking spurring him to continue walking. "Reed isn't just a collector. He's a trainer, a conditioner. He prepares these children for whatever purpose his clients intend." Miles felt sick at the implication. "You mean he breaks them?" Whitman's expression was grim. "Yes, the fact that Ruby has maintained her spirit, her sense of self, speaks to extraordinary inner strength." They continued in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Miles found himself wondering about Margaret, about the research she had been part of before they met. Had she known when they married that her past might someday intersect with their future? Had she seen in him some connection to the work she'd left behind? You said Margaret changed her name, Miles said abruptly. What was she called before? Whitman glanced at him, surprise evident in his aged features. Margaret was always her first name, but her surname was Abernathy, no relation to you as far as we knew. An extraordinary coincidence that she later married a man with the same family name. Miles stopped in his tracks. Abernathy Margaret was an Abernathy before we met. Whitman nodded. She was William's research assistant for several years. They became quite close, a mentor relationship, almost father and daughter. When he died, she took his name in his honor. It caused quite a stir at the Institute. Miles struggled to process this revelation. Margaret had never mentioned, knowing his father had never indicated any connection to the name she shared with him. Their meeting at a music hall in Boston, their courtship, their marriage, all of it had seemed so natural, so uncomplicated. She never told me, he said quietly. Perhaps she feared it would seem calculated, Whitman suggested. Or perhaps she simply wanted to leave that part of her life behind entirely. After William's death, after the research took its darker turn, Margaret became disillusioned. The barking grew suddenly louder, accompanied by men's voices. Miles grabbed Whitman's arm, pulling him behind a fallen tree. "They're closer than I thought," he whispered. "We need to change direction now." They veered northward toward a ridge of granite outcroppings that rose from the forest floor like the spine of some ancient, half-buried creature. If they could reach those rocks, they could move without leaving tracks in the snow. As they hurried through the trees, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering bark inches from Miles's head. He dropped to one knee, pulling Whitman down beside him. "Stay low," he ordered, scanning the forest behind them. Three figures moved among the distant trees, Reed's men rifles raised. Another shot cracked through the cold air wide of its mark. "They're still too far for accuracy," Miles observed, "but they've spotted us. Run for the rocks. I'll cover you." "I won't leave you," Whitman protested. "This isn't a debate," Miles snapped. "Go, now." As Whitman scrambled toward the rocky ridge, Miles raised his rifle and fired a warning shot high over the pursuers' heads. It wouldn't stop them, but it might slow them down, make them more cautious in their approach. Miles waited until Whitman had nearly reached the rocks before following, keeping low and using the trees for cover. More shots sounded behind him, but none came close. Whoever Reed had sent weren't experienced woodsmen. They were firing hastily, wasting ammunition. He joined Whitman at the base of the rocky outcropping. The climb would be steep, challenging for the elderly doctor. "I'll help you," Miles said, shouldering his rifle. "Take my hand." Together, they ascended, finding footholds in the weathered granite, pulling themselves up inch by painful inch. Miles's muscles burned with the effort of supporting both his weight and partially Whitman's, but he pushed through the pain, focusing on the ridge above. Behind them, Reed's men had reached the base of the outcropping and begun their own ascent. Miles could hear them cursing as they slipped on the icy stone. Finally, Miles and Whitman reached the ridge. The far side sloped more gradually down to a series of smaller rock formations, a natural labyrinth that stretched for nearly a mile before returning to forest. "We can lose them here," Miles said, helping Whitman navigate the uneven terrain. "Move from rock to rock. Leave no tracks in the snow between." They proceeded carefully, using the stone pathways as much as possible. Occasionally, they were forced to cross small patches of snow, but Miles brushed away their footprints with a pine branch he'd broken off for that purpose. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, then stopped altogether. Still, Miles didn't slow their pace. Reed's men might have lost their trail, but they would continue searching the area. By mid-afternoon, they had navigated the rock labyrinth and re-entered the forest on its western edge. Miles estimated they had circled halfway back toward Pinewood. "We should rest," Whitman suggested, his face pale with exhaustion. "Just for a few minutes." Miles hesitated, then nodded. They found shelter beneath a massive pine, its lower branches creating a relatively snow-free hollow against the trunk. Sitting with their backs against the rough bark, they shared the last of the jerky from Miles's pack. "Do you think they made it?" Miles asked quietly. "Cooper and Ruby." "Cooper seemed capable," Whitman replied. "And Ruby is nothing if not resourceful." Miles stared into the distance, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. "I keep thinking about what you told me about Margaret, about my father. All those years, and I never knew." He looked at Whitman. "Why didn't she tell me?" Whitman considered the question. "Perhaps she feared it would change how you saw her. Or perhaps she worried it would put you in danger." "What danger?" "William's death was never properly investigated," Whitman said carefully. "I had my suspicions, but no proof. If Margaret shared those suspicions, she might have feared the same people would target you if you started asking questions." Miles thought of the life they'd built together in Boston, the music, the joy of Victoria's birth, the peaceful rhythms of their days. Had Margaret carried this shadow with her all that time? Had she looked over her shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with them? "And now," Miles asked, "why has this all surfaced now after so many years?" "I believe it began with Ruby's kidnapping," Whitman replied. "Thomas Sullivan reached out to me when she was taken, knowing of my work with gifted children. When I started investigating, I reconnected with former colleagues, including Clark. He had been tracking the Black Glove for years, documenting their activities. And somehow, he discovered I was in Montana. Yes, he learned that one of Reed's operations was based in this territory and came to investigate. When he realized you were nearby, the son of William Abernathy, husband to Margaret, he saw it as providential. A chance to find safe haven for Ruby while gathering evidence against the organization." Miles shook his head, marveling at the tangled threads of fate that had led them all to this moment. "And the fire that killed Margaret and Victoria, was that connected too? Was it truly an accident?" Whitman's expression grew troubled. "I don't know. I've often wondered. The timing was suspicious. Margaret had recently contacted me, expressing concern about children going missing from her music program. Gifted children. She thought someone might be identifying them, targeting them specifically." The implication sent a chill through Miles that had nothing to do with the winter cold. Could Margaret and Victoria's deaths have been deliberate? Could his absence that fateful night have been orchestrated to ensure he wasn't caught in the same trap? Before he could pursue this horrifying thought, a sound caught his attention, the distant crack of a branch breaking underfoot. Miles rose immediately, signaling for Whitman to remain silent. Nothing moved among the trees. The forest held its breath, the only sound the occasional plop of snow falling from branches in the afternoon sun. Then Miles saw it, a flash of movement about 50 yards away, a dark figure slipping from tree to tree. "They've found us," he whispered, helping Whitman to his feet. "We need to keep moving." They continued westward, moving as quietly as possible through the winter forest. Miles kept them to the densest parts of the woodland where the pine canopy had prevented heavy snow accumulation, and their tracks would be less visible. As daylight began to fade, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing ahead. In its center stood a dilapidated cabin, not June's, but an old trapper's shelter Miles recognized from his hunting expeditions. "We'll stop there," he decided. "Make a stand, if necessary." The cabin was little more than a shell, 4 walls, a sagging roof, a stone fireplace filled with years of debris, but it offered concealment and a defensible position. Miles guided Whitman inside, barring the door behind them with a fallen beam. "Check for another exit," he instructed as he positioned himself at the single-window rifle ready. Whitman moved around the small space, pushing aside cobwebs and rotting furniture. "There's a trap door," he reported. "Likely a root cellar or storage space." "Good. If they come, that's your way out. Head north about a quarter-mile and you'll hit a stream. Follow it west to Pinewood." "And leave you here alone, I think not." Miles turned from the window, fixing the older man with a stern gaze. "This isn't heroics, Doctor. If they take us both, there's no one left to help Ruby. You need to reach June's cabin, make sure Cooper got her there safely." Whitman seemed about to argue further when a voice called from outside. "Abernathy, we know you're in there. Come out now, and no one needs to get hurt." Miles motioned for Whitman to stay back, then called in response, "Who's asking?" "Name's Victor Reed. My brother wants a word with you about something you took that belongs to him." Miles recalled Ruby's descriptions of Silas Reed's brother, a cruel man who had assisted in her captivity. "The girl doesn't belong to anyone," he shouted back. "Least of all Reed." A different voice answered deeper with a cultured accent that seemed at odds with the wilderness setting. "Mr. Abernathy, this is Silas Reed. I believe we've had a misunderstanding. The child under your protection is valuable special. She requires care that only specialized facilities can provide." Miles felt disgust rise in his throat. "Specialized facilities? Is that what you call places where children are experimented on? Where they're broken for profit?" A pause. Then Reed's voice again, harder now. "You've been misinformed by Clark and Whitman. They're idealists who don't understand the greater purpose of our work. Ruby Sullivan possesses abilities that could benefit humanity greatly if properly developed." "By humanity, you mean the wealthy men who buy children from you," Miles retorted. "We know about the Black Glove Reed. We know about Hollister and the others. It's over." Another pause, longer this time. When Reed spoke again, all pretense of civility had vanished from his voice. "The girl has information in her head that belongs to me. Surrender her now, tell me where she is, and you walk away. Continue this foolishness, and you'll join Clark in an unmarked grave." Miles glanced at Whitman, who had moved to the trapdoor and was ready to descend. "Go," he mouthed silently. The doctor nodded reluctantly, disappearing into the darkness below. "You'll have to come and get me, Reed," Miles called. "But I should warn you, I've spent 17 years in these mountains. I know how to handle men like you." A shot shattered the window beside him, sending Miles diving for cover. More shots followed, peppering the cabin's wooden walls with holes that let in threads of fading daylight. Miles counted at least 3 different weapons, firing Reed, his brother Victor, and at least one more man. They were spread out around the cabin, making it impossible for him to target them all. He returned fire, carefully conserving ammunition, aiming at muzzle flashes rather than the men themselves. He didn't need to hit them, only keep them at bay until darkness fell completely. Then he might have a chance to slip away and circle back toward June's cabin. The exchange continued as the last light drained from the sky. Miles had just shifted position to cover the door when a new sound reached him. A metallic clicking followed by a whoosh of ignition. The smell of kerosene filled his nostrils. They were setting the cabin ablaze. Miles scrambled to the trapdoor, pulling it open and dropping down into the narrow earthen cellar. Whitman was nowhere to be seen. He had already escaped through the crude tunnel that led away from the cabin. Following the tunnel, Miles emerged in the forest about 20 yards from the burning structure. The fire had fully engulfed the roof, now sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. Reed and his men were silhouetted against the flames, watching for any sign of Miles trying to flee. Moving with the silent precision developed over years of hunting, Miles circled behind them. He could shoot them now, end the threat permanently. His finger tightened on the trigger as he sighted on Reed's back. Then he hesitated. Miles Abernathy had killed animals for food and protection, but never a man. Even now, with everything at stake, he found himself unwilling to cross that line. Instead, he slipped away through the darkness, using the forest he knew so intimately to mask his escape. As he moved westward toward Pinewood, toward Ruby, the burning cabin receded behind him, a beacon marking yet another shelter, lost, another refuge destroyed. Miles traveled through the night, pushing himself beyond exhaustion. Every step took him closer to Ruby, to the promise he'd made to find her again. The cold seeped into his bones, but he barely noticed it, focused solely on the path ahead. Near dawn, he reached the outskirts of Pinewood. The trading post sat dark and quiet in the gray morning light. Miles approached cautiously, alert for signs of Reed's men or other dangers. The door opened before he could knock, and June Sawyer stood framed in the doorway, a shotgun cradled in her arms. "About time you showed up," she said by way of greeting. "Get in here before someone spots you." Inside the trading post was warm and dim lanterns turned low. June led Miles to the back room where he had first found Ruby. There, seated by a small fire, was Dr. Whitman, his face haggard but relieved at the sight of Miles. "Thank God," the doctor murmured. "When I heard the cabin collapse, I feared the worst." "Where's Ruby?" Miles demanded, looking around the small room. "And Cooper?" June and Whitman exchanged glances that sent a bolt of fear through Miles's heart. "Cooper brought her here yesterday afternoon," June said carefully. "They reached my cabin safely, but they were followed. Not by Reed's men, by someone else. A man in an expensive coat who claimed to be from the federal government." "Hollister," Miles guessed, remembering the name from Ruby's encoded music. June nodded. Cooper confirmed it later. U.S. Marshal James Hollister himself, come all the way from Helena on official business, said he was investigating the murder of Dr. Clark. "What happened?" June's expression darkened. "Hollister demanded to see Ruby, said he had information that she was a material witness to the crime. Cooper tried to refuse, but Hollister had papers, official documents authorizing him to take the child into protective custody." Miles felt his legs weaken beneath him. He sank onto a chair, dread filling his chest. "He took her. Cooper wouldn't allow it," June continued. "He stood his ground, demanded to see authorization from Hollister's superiors. That's when things got ugly." She paused, her weathered face grim. "Hollister shot him, right there in my cabin. Said Cooper had gone mad, was interfering with a federal investigation." Miles closed his eyes briefly, grief for the sheriff washing over him. Cooper had been an honest man, in the end, willing to die protecting a child who wasn't his responsibility. "And Ruby?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hollister took her," June confirmed. "But not before she managed to leave this." She crossed to a shelf and retrieved something small and dark, the wooden knight from the chess set. In Miles's cabin, the piece Ruby had been fond of moving as she sat by the fire. Miles took it, turning it over in his palm. Carved into the base were 3 letters, HLN. "Helena," Miles said. "She's telling us where they're taking her." Whitman nodded. "Hollister mentioned returning to Helena immediately. He has an office there and connections to the territorial government." "Then that's where we're going," Miles said, rising with new determination. "How soon can we leave?" "My wagon's ready now," June replied. Supply run to Helena was scheduled for today anyway. You and Whitman can ride in the back, hidden under the false floor. It's cramped, but it'll get you there unnoticed. What about Reed and his men? Miles asked. They'll be looking for us. Already taken care of, June said with grim satisfaction. Sent word to them through one of the trappers that you were spotted heading east toward the mountains. They rode out at first light opposite direction from Helena. Miles felt a surge of gratitude for this tough, resourceful woman who had become an unexpected ally. Thank you, June, for everything. June waved away his thanks. Just bring that child back safe. She deserves better than whatever Hollister and his cronies have planned for her. Within the hour, they were on the road to Helena. Miles and Whitman lay concealed in the cramped space beneath the wagon's false floor, surrounded by sacks of grain and flour that ostensibly filled the conveyance. Air reached them through small, carefully disguised holes, and June had provided blankets against the cold that seeped through the wooden boards. As the wagon rumbled along the rutted trail, Miles clutched the wooden knight in his palm, thinking of Ruby. Was she afraid? Was she safe? She's strong, Whitman said softly, as if reading Miles's thoughts. Stronger than any child I've encountered in all my years of research. She shouldn't have to be, Miles replied, anger sharpening his tone. She should be safe, not used as a weapon or tool. Whitman studied him for a moment. You love her, he observed. As a father loves a child. The words struck Miles with their simple truth. From the moment Ruby awakened his music after 17 years of silence, she had become the daughter of his heart. I promise to find her, he said firmly. I intend to keep that promise. The journey to Helena took the better part of 2 days. June drove steadily, stopping only when necessary to rest the horses. At night, Miles and Whitman emerged from their hiding place to stretch cramped muscles and eat the simple provisions June had packed. On the evening of the second day, the lights of Helena appeared in the distance, a sprawling settlement that served as the territorial capital. Unlike the rugged trading posts and mining camps Miles had occasionally visited, Helena boasted proper streets, substantial buildings of brick and stone hotels, and government offices that spoke of permanence and civilization. June stopped the wagon in a quiet area at the city's edge. This is as far as I go, she told Miles and Whitman as they climbed stiffly from their hiding place. Marshal's office is downtown near the government buildings. Can't miss it. You're not coming with us? Miles asked. June shook her head. Got supplies to deliver, and besides, I'm known to Hollister. He'd recognize me instantly. She reached into her coat and withdrew a small pouch. This is from Cooper's Effects. Thought you might need it. Inside the pouch, Miles found Cooper's badge, a small amount of money, and most importantly, a key with a number etched into its surface. Safety deposit box at the Helena National Bank, June explained. Cooper mentioned it once, said if anything happened to him, the contents should go to the Chicago authorities. Evidence against the Black Glove, Whitman surmised. Documentation of their operations, perhaps names of involved parties, beyond what Ruby encoded in the music. If we can access it, Miles said, pocketing the key. Thank you, June, for everything. The older woman nodded briskly. Good luck, and Abernathy. She fixed him with a stern gaze. Bring that child home, whatever it takes. As June's wagon rumbled away into the night, Miles and Whitman made their way toward the center of Helena. The streets were relatively quiet, most businesses closed for the evening. They passed saloons still bright with lamplight and raucous with voices, hotels with curtained windows, shops shuttered until morning. We need a place to stay, Whitman said. Somewhere discreet, where we can plan our next move. They found a small boarding house on a side street, the kind that asked few questions of its guests. The elderly woman who ran it accepted their payment without comment, showing them to a spare but clean room with 2 narrow beds. Once alone, Miles paced the small confines of the room, unable to rest despite his exhaustion. "We need to locate Ruby," he said. "The marshal's office is the obvious place to start, but we can't simply walk in and ask for her." "No," Whitman agreed. "Hollister would have us arrested immediately or worse." He sat on the edge of one bed, looking every one of his 70 years. "The bank should be our first stop tomorrow. Cooper's evidence might give us leverage, something we can use to force Hollister's hand." Miles nodded, though the delay chafed at him. Every hour Ruby remained in Hollister's custody was an hour too long. What was happening to her now? Was she being interrogated? Forced to reveal what she knew about the black glove? Was she being prepared for transport to some facility where her extraordinary mind would be exploited? He left a note for Whitman explaining his plan. The bank wouldn't open for hours yet, and Miles couldn't wait idly while Ruby remained in danger. He would scout the marshal's office, assess the security, determine if Ruby was indeed being held there. By the time Whitman awoke and visited the bank, Miles would have valuable information for their rescue attempt. The streets of Helena were coming to life. As Miles made his way downtown, shop owners unlocking their businesses, delivery wagons making morning rounds, early risers heading to work. He kept his hat pulled low, avoiding direct eye contact with passers-by. The marshal's office wasn't difficult to find, a substantial brick building with the territorial flag flying outside. Miles observed it from across the street, noting the 2 armed deputies standing guard at the entrance. The windows were barred, the door heavy oak. Getting inside unnoticed would be nearly impossible. As he watched, a carriage pulled up outside the office. A well-dressed man stepped out, tall, distinguished, with silver at his temples, and an air of unquestionable authority. Marshal James Hollister. Miles guessed, committing the man's face to memory. Hollister spoke briefly to the guards, then entered the building. Minutes later, another carriage arrived. This one was larger, with curtained windows and a uniformed driver. 2 men emerged first, followed by a small figure that made Miles's heart leap in his chest: Ruby. She looked pale, but unharmed. Her red hair neatly combed her small body, dressed in clothes finer than anything Miles had seen her wear before. She moved with the hesitant steps of someone still adjusting to crutches, guided by one of the men who hovered protectively at her side. Miles wanted to call out, to rush across the street and sweep her into his arms, but he forced himself to remain still, watching as Ruby was escorted into the marshal's office. At least now he knew she was here, alive, and apparently well treated. It was something to hold on to. Returning to the boarding house, Miles found Whitman awake and preparing to leave for the bank. "I saw her," Miles reported, the relief evident in his voice. "She's at the marshal's office. She appeared unharmed." Whitman nodded, absorbing this information. "Good. That gives us time to access Cooper's deposit box and formulate a proper plan." He studied Miles with concern. "You look exhausted. Did you sleep at all?" Miles shook his head. "I'll rest when Ruby is safe." They walked together to the Helena National Bank, a grand stone building that spoke of the territory's growing prosperity. Inside, Miles presented Cooper's key to a teller, explaining that the sheriff had authorized him to collect the contents in the event of his death. "I'll need to see some identification, sir," the teller said doubtfully. Miles produced Cooper's badge. "Sheriff Cooper was killed in the line of duty. I'm here on official business to retrieve evidence critical to an ongoing investigation." The badge worked its magic. The teller summoned a manager who led Miles and Whitman to a private room where the safety deposit box was brought to them. Inside the box, they found a leather portfolio containing documents, photographs, and a small journal. Cooper had been thorough in his investigation of the black glove. There were lists of missing children from across the territory and beyond financial records showing payments to various officials, including Marshal Hollister, and most damning of all, a series of letters between Hollister and Silas Reed discussing the acquisition and processing of children with special abilities. "This is it," Whitman breathed, scanning the documents. "Everything we need to expose the entire operation." "But how do we use it?" Miles asked. "If Hollister is as connected as these records suggest, going to the local authorities would be useless." "Not useless," Whitman corrected. "Dangerous. We'd likely find ourselves arrested or worse before we could present the evidence." He thought for a moment. "We need someone outside Hollister's sphere of influence. Someone with the authority to act on this information." "The governor," Miles suggested. Whitman shook his head. "These documents implicate officials at the territorial level. We need federal intervention." His expression brightened suddenly. "The Circuit Court Judge William Harper is scheduled to arrive in Helena today for the quarterly session. His authority supersedes Hollister's, and he answers directly to Washington." It was a plan not perfect, but better than anything else they had. They carefully replaced the documents in the portfolio, thanked the bank manager, and returned to the boarding house to wait for Judge Harper's arrival. The waiting was excruciating. Every passing minute meant Ruby remained in Hollister's custody, vulnerable and alone. By mid-afternoon, word spread that Judge Harper's train had arrived. The circuit court would convene the following morning. "We need to reach him tonight," Miles decided, "before Hollister can intercept us or move Ruby." They set out for the Grand Helena Hotel, where the judge traditionally stayed. In the ornate lobby, with its polished wood and brass fixtures, Miles felt acutely out of place in his rough mountain attire, drawing curious glances from well-dressed guests. The desk clerk was initially reluctant to confirm Judge Harper's presence, but Whitman's cultured accent and authoritative manner eventually persuaded him to send a message to the judge's suite. "Please inform His Honor that Dr. Oscar Whitman from Boston requests an urgent meeting regarding a matter of federal concern," Whitman instructed, pressing a coin into the clerk's palm. They waited in the lobby, Miles fighting the urge to pace. After what seemed an eternity, a porter approached them. "Judge Harper will see you now, gentlemen. Please follow me." They were led to a suite on the hotel's third floor. Inside, Judge William Harper, a stout man with an impressive beard and piercing eyes, awaited them, still dressed in his traveling clothes. "Dr. Whitman," the judge greeted, extending his hand. "Your message sounded most urgent. And this is Miles Abernathy," Miles supplied, shaking the judge's firm grip. "Thank you for seeing us, Your Honor." "Well, I can't say I'm not intrigued," Harper admitted, gesturing for them to sit. "It's not often I receive visitors before I've even unpacked my robes. What is this federal matter that can't wait until morning?" Whitman launched into a concise explanation of the Black Glove Ruby's kidnapping, Clark's murder, and Cooper's death. Miles watched the judge's expression shift from skepticism to concern to outright alarm as Whitman detailed Hollister's involvement and presented Cooper's evidence. "These are extremely serious allegations," Harper said when Whitman had finished. "If true, they represent corruption at a level that cannot be tolerated." He examined some of the documents more closely. "And you say the Sullivan child is currently in Marshal Hollister's custody, here in Helena?" "Yes," Miles confirmed.
"I saw her myself this morning, being taken into the marshal's office." Harper stroked his beard thoughtfully.
"Under normal circumstances, I would issue a warrant immediately. But if Hollister is indeed corrupt, he may have deputies loyal to him rather than to the law. A direct confrontation could put the child at greater risk." "What do you suggest, Your Honor?" Whitman asked. A more subtle approach, Harper replied. I'll send an official summons requiring Hollister to bring the child before the court tomorrow morning. He won't dare refuse a direct judicial order. It would raise too many questions. Once the child is in my courtroom, I can place her under the court's protection while we investigate these charges fully. It wasn't immediate action, but it was their best hope for rescuing Ruby legally and safely. Miles reluctantly agreed to the plan, though the thought of Ruby spending another night in Hollister's custody filled him with dread. They left the judge with the portfolio of evidence and returned to the boarding house to prepare for the court session the following day. Miles cleaned his rifle and checked June's revolver, determined to be ready if the legal approach failed. Try to rest, Whitman urged again, seeing the exhaustion etched in Miles's face. Tomorrow will test us all. This time Miles did sleep, though fitfully. His dreams were still troubled, but now they contained a new element: Ruby, safe in his arms, returning to the mountain cabin that had briefly been their home. Morning arrived with a light snowfall unusual for early March. Miles and Whitman made their way to the territorial courthouse, joining the crowd of citizens gathered for the quarterly court session. Inside the courtroom was already filling with lawyers, defendants, and spectators. Judge Harper entered precisely at 9 o'clock, his black robes lending him an imposing presence despite his short stature. The bailiff called the court to order, and Harper addressed the assembled crowd. Before we proceed with the regular docket, I have issued a special summons in the matter of Ruby Sullivan, a minor currently in the protective custody of the U.S. Marshal's office. Marshal Hollister, please bring the child forward. A murmur ran through the courtroom as Hollister rose from his seat in the front row. Your Honor, he began smoothly. I must respectfully inform the court that the child in question is a material witness in an ongoing federal investigation. Her appearance in open court could compromise that investigation. Harper's expression hardened. Marshal Hollister, this is not a request. It is a direct order from this court. Produce the child immediately, or I shall hold you in contempt. Hollister's confident demeanor faltered slightly. Of course, Your Honor. However, I must inform the court that the child was transferred early this morning to federal authorities from Chicago. She is no longer in my custody. Miles felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath him. Ruby gone, transported away while they waited for legal processes. He half rose from his seat, restraining himself only when Whitman placed a warning hand on his arm. Judge Harper's face darkened with anger. Marshal Hollister, are you telling this court that you transferred a child who was the subject of a judicial summons without court approval? The transfer was arranged before I received your summons. Your Honor, Hollister replied, his composure returning. Federal agents arrived with the proper documentation to take custody of the Sullivan child as part of an ongoing investigation into her kidnapping. I merely fulfilled my duty to cooperate with federal authorities. Harper was not satisfied. I want to see this documentation immediately, Marshal, and I want the names of these federal agents and their destination. As Hollister fumbled for a response, the courtroom doors opened. A hush fell over the assembled crowd as a man entered, followed by two uniformed police officers, and between them, a small figure with vibrant red hair. Miles's heart leaped. Ruby, and beside her a tall, distinguished-looking man who bore a striking resemblance to the child. Your Honor, the man said in a clear voice, I am Daniel Sullivan of Chicago. This is my daughter, Ruby Sullivan, who was kidnapped from our home 3 years ago. I understand the court has taken an interest in her case. Judge Harper recovered quickly from his surprise. Indeed, we have, Mr. Sullivan. Please approach the bench and bring your daughter with you. As the Sullivans moved forward, Ruby's gaze scanned the courtroom. When she spotted Miles, her face transformed with joy. Breaking away from her father, she moved with surprising speed on her crutches, making her way directly to where Miles and Whitman sat. "Miles," she cried, and the simple word contained volumes of relief and happiness. Unable to help himself, Miles swept her into his arms, holding her close as she clung to him with fierce intensity. "You're safe," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe now." Daniel Sullivan approached more slowly, watching the reunion with a complex expression. "You must be the man my daughter has spoken of incessantly since I found her," he said. "The mountain man who saved her life." Miles looked up, still holding Ruby. "I didn't save her," he corrected. "She saved herself. I just helped a little." Ruby pulled back slightly to look at Miles, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "You played music again," she said simply. For me, the courtroom had fallen silent, watching this unexpected drama unfold. Judge Harper cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in my chambers," he suggested. "Marshal Hollister, you will accompany us, and I believe we should have Marshal Hollister's deputies secure the courtroom exits. We wouldn't want anyone leaving prematurely." Hollister's face had gone pale. His earlier confidence evaporated. As they followed the judge to his private chambers, Miles kept his arm protectively around Ruby's shoulders, still hardly believing she was safe. In the judge's chambers, the full story emerged. Daniel Sullivan, a music professor at Northwestern University, had never stopped searching for his kidnapped daughter. When authorities in Chicago received Cooper's telegraph about a child matching Ruby's description, Sullivan had immediately traveled to Montana. He'd arrived in Helena just as Hollister was preparing to transport Ruby elsewhere, not to legitimate federal authorities, but to a private facility operated by the Black Glove. "If I'd been an hour later," Sullivan said grimly, "she would have been gone. As it was, I had to produce considerable documentation and threaten legal action before Hollister would release her to me." Harper turned to Hollister, who stood rigidly by the door. "Marshal, based on the evidence presented to this court, I am placing you under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Officers, please take the marshal into custody." As Hollister was led away, his face a mask of cold fury. Ruby looked up at Miles. "Is it over?" she asked quietly. "Really over?" Miles glanced at Judge Harper, who nodded gravely. "Yes, Ruby," Miles said. "It's really over. Hollister will face justice, and the evidence Cooper gathered will help dismantle the entire Black Glove organization. Reed and his brother won't hurt any more children." Ruby's shoulders sagged with relief, and for the first time since Miles had known her, she looked truly her age, a 7-year-old child carrying burdens far too heavy for her small frame. Daniel Sullivan approached, kneeling before his daughter. "Ruby," he said gently, "your mother is waiting for us in Chicago. She's been preparing your room, redecorating it exactly as you had it before." He hesitated. "Would you like to go home now?" Ruby looked between her father and Miles, conflict evident in her expression. "Can Miles come too?" she asked. Sullivan glanced at Miles, something like understanding in his gaze. "Of course he can visit. Any time he wishes. Our home will always be open to the man who saved you." But Miles knew what Ruby was really asking. Could he be part of her life permanently? The answer to that was far more complicated. This man before him was Ruby's father, her blood, her rightful family. Miles was what? A temporary guardian, a brief sanctuary in the storm of her young life. Ruby, Miles said, kneeling beside Sullivan so he could look directly into her eyes. Your home is with your parents. They've been searching for you all this time, never giving up hope. That's where you belong. Ruby's lower lip trembled. But what about you? You'll be all alone in the mountains again. Miles felt something catch in his throat. I won't be alone, he said softly. Not really. Not anymore. Because now I'll have memories of you, of the music we shared. And someday, when you're older, perhaps you'll come visit. See the cabin, hear the wolves howl at night, watch the sun rise over the pines. Promise? Ruby asked, her voice small but hopeful. I promise, Miles replied. And I'll write to you. Every month. Tell you about the ravens stealing from my food cache, about the first wildflowers in spring, about all the things we didn't have time to share. Ruby seemed to accept this, nodding slowly. I'll write too. And I'll practice violin every day, so when I visit we can play together. Later that day, as Miles stood on the platform of the Helena train station, watching Ruby and her father board the eastbound train to Chicago, he felt both loss and fulfillment intertwined in his heart. Ruby had changed him, awakened him from a 17-year slumber of grief and isolation. Whatever came next, he would not return to that half-life in the mountains. Dr. Whitman joined him on the platform, watching the train preparations with a thoughtful expression. What will you do now, Abernathy, return to your cabin? Miles considered the question. For a time, he said, there are things I need to settle preparations to make. He glanced at the elderly doctor. And then I think perhaps Boston. There are questions about my father, about Margaret, that I need to answer. I could help with that, Whitman offered. My records from that time, my memories, they might fill in some of the blanks. The train whistle blew a shrill sound cutting through the station's bustle. As it began to move, Ruby appeared at a window, her small hand pressed against the glass. Miles raised his own hand in farewell, holding the pose until the train had disappeared around a bend. She'll be all right, Whitman said gently. The Sullivans are good people, and the evidence Judge Harper is sending to Washington should ensure the black glove is dismantled completely. Ruby will be safe. I know, Miles replied. That's all that matters. A week later, Miles stood in his cabin, surveying the space that had been his refuge and prison for 17 years. The silence felt different now, not the empty quiet of isolation, but a pregnant pause between movements of a greater composition. On the table lay a half-packed rucksack containing only essentials for his journey east. His father's pocket watch rested beside it, gleaming in the afternoon light. He'd spent the morning sorting through his possessions, deciding what to leave behind. Most of the traps and tools would stay, perhaps another lost soul would find use for them someday. The violin, however, was carefully secured in its case, ready to travel. He would not abandon music again. As Miles lifted a loose floorboard to retrieve the small cache of money he'd kept for emergencies, his fingers brushed against something unexpected, a small leather-bound book he didn't recognize. Pulling it free, he discovered a journal, the pages yellowed with age. Opening to the first entry, he felt his breath catch. May 15th, 1857. William believed we could help children with our work, that the code could unlock minds trapped in silence or trauma. I must continue what he started, but carefully. They're watching me now. If anything happens, I've hidden copies of our research in places only someone who understands harmonic perception would recognize. The lullaby contains the first key. M.A. Margaret. His Margaret writing just weeks before they'd met. M.A. Margaret Abernathy. She must have hidden this journal during their brief visit to Montana for his concert tour, somehow knowing she might never return to retrieve it. Had she sensed even then that forces were aligning against them, Miles closed the journal and added it to his pack. There were answers waiting in Boston about his father, about Margaret, about a conspiracy that had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Ruby's story had ended happily, but Miles now understood that his own story was far from over. He lifted his pack and violin case, took one last look at the cabin that had sheltered his grief for so many years, and stepped outside, pulling the door firmly shut behind him. He didn't bother to lock it. That part of his life was finished. The trail stretched before him, winding down from his mountain sanctuary toward the wider world. For the first time in 17 years, Miles Abernathy walked it without the weight of despair. In its place was purpose, and a melody that continued to play in his mind, Victoria's lullaby, now transformed from a song of loss into something new. A key, a beginning, a promise. But as they turned to leave the station, Miles knew it wasn't quite all that mattered. Ruby had given him back more than just music. She had reminded him how to care, how to connect, how to live fully in the world, rather than merely survive at its edges. The mountains would always be there, unchanged by time or circumstance. But Miles Abernathy would return to them a changed man, carrying with him the melody of a red-haired child who had taught him that even the deepest wounds could heal that loss, and love could coexist in the same heart, that music could bridge the distance between souls. And somewhere in Chicago, a little girl would be practicing her violin, playing the lullaby Miles had taught her, keeping their connection alive through the universal language they shared. A melody born under the pines, carried forward on the wings of hope and memory.